The private dining room at Auberge d'Orval in Old Montreal had a way of making people feel like they were the only ones who mattered in the world, and that, Marguerite had learned in 4 years of waiting tables there, was precisely the problem. The room sat 12 comfortably, 20 if the kitchen was willing to suffer for it, and the walls were lined with reclaimed oak panels that had supposedly come from a chateau in Burgundy, though Marguerite privately doubted anyone had ever verified that claim. The lighting was warm and low, the kind that made everyone look like they had just returned from somewhere expensive, and the carpet absorbed sound so completely that you could drop a tray of crystal, and the guests at the next table might not even look up. It was, in every sense, a room designed to protect the people inside it from the inconvenience of the outside world. Marguerite Aussi had been assigned to table 3 that night, which meant she would be spending the next 4 hours invisible. She had a degree. Almost. 2 semesters, short of a master's in international business from McGill, with a minor in East Asian studies and a language proficiency in Mandarin that her professors had called, without exaggeration, remarkable. She had grown up in a household where her Ghanaian father spoke French to her mother and English to the neighbors and Twi. When he thought the children weren't listening, and somewhere in the middle of all that, languages had simply become the medium in which Marguerite thought. By 22, she had added Mandarin to the list. By 24, she had added enough Japanese to hold a proper conversation. By 26, she had dropped out of her graduate program and taken a job carrying plates. Her mother's diagnosis had come in February during Marguerite's 2nd semester. Pancreatic cancer, stage 2, the kind that required immediate surgery and months of treatment, and the sort of ongoing medical costs that crept past the edges of what provincial coverage would absorb. Her father had retired early due to his own health. Her younger brother was still in CEGEP. There was no one else, so Marguerite had withdrawn, temporarily, she told herself, just until things stabilized. She had kept telling herself that for 22 months now, Auberge d'Orval paid well for this kind of work, better than most places in the city, and the tips in the private dining room could be extraordinary when the right clients came through. Marguerite was good at it, too. She moved with the particular economy of someone who has trained herself to take up as little space as possible while remaining completely efficient, anticipating refills before glasses were empty, appearing at the precise moment a guest reached for something that wasn't there yet. The maitre d', a man named Gaston who had been running the front of house for 19 years and showed it in the particular set of his shoulders, had told her once that she had the best instincts of anyone he had ever trained. He meant it as a compliment. She took it as one. None of that was going to matter tonight. Table 3 had been booked under the name Van Torp and Associates, which told Marguerite nothing specific but implied the sort of corporate dinner where someone was trying to close something significant. The reservation had come through 3 weeks earlier, confirmed twice, with a note requesting that the private room be available from 7 until 10 with no interruptions unless requested. Gaston had flagged it internally as a priority booking, which meant Marguerite would be the only server assigned to the room, with a runner available outside if she needed support. She arrived at table 3 at 6:58 to light the tapers and check the placement one final time, and she was straightening the last water glass when the door opened and the guests began to arrive. The first through the door was a man named Warren Bellecourt, and Marguerite recognized the type before she had finished registering his face. 50, possibly 55. The kind of fit that came from a personal trainer rather than anything that had required genuine discipline, wearing a suit that was expensively cut but worn with the casual loosenesses of a man who considered getting dressed an obligation rather than a practice. He walked into the room like he owned it and every room adjacent to it, and he glanced at Marguerite the way people glance at furniture they have already decided is adequate. Behind him came his associate, a younger man introduced briefly as Sheridan, the kind of polished, silent presence that senior partners brought to dinners like this to take notes and speak only when prompted. He nodded at Marguerite without making eye contact and took the chair to Bellecourt's left, and then, a half step behind them both, came the woman they had apparently come to meet. She was perhaps 60, composed in the way that certain people are composed. Not as a performance but as a settled condition, something that had long since stopped requiring effort. She wore a charcoal kipau-style jacket over dark trousers, her silver-streaked hair pulled back simply, and she carried herself with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where other people were trying to impress her. Her name, Marguerite, would learn from the place card at the head of the table, was Mei Xing Zhao. She was, based on the deference that both Bellecourt and Sheridan were performing, clearly the person in the room with the most money. She was also, based on the expression she was wearing as Bellecourt launched into what appeared to be a prepared welcome speech, clearly not understanding a single word of it. Marguerite noticed this in the way she noticed most things at work. Quietly, from a position that no one was paying attention to, while pouring water into a glass that didn't yet need filling. Mrs. Zhao's face was polite and entirely unreadable, which was almost certainly intentional, but her eyes were tracking the room rather than Bellecourt's face, and she had not once responded to anything he said with more than a slight tilt of her head. She accepted the menu from Sheridan with a gracious nod and held it with the relaxed hands of someone who had decided some time ago that she would not let confusion show. Bellecourt, to his credit, or rather to his profound discredit, did not appear to notice any of this. "We're so pleased you were able to make the trip, Mrs. Zhao," he said, settling into his chair and picking up the wine list, as though he had already decided what everyone at the table would be drinking. "Montreal is extraordinary this time of year, very European, which I imagine feels familiar." Mrs. Zhao smiled. It was the smile of someone who has long since made peace with other people's assumptions about her. Marguerite stood near the sideboard and watched Bellecourt for the next 12 minutes, and what she saw was a man who had prepared extensively for a dinner with a woman he had never once considered it necessary to actually communicate with. He had printed materials, he had a tablet, which Sheridan produced at the appropriate moment and angled toward Mrs. Zhao with the rehearsed ease of a move they had clearly practiced. He had a narrative about his company's expansion into Pacific markets that he delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who has said the same thing many times and received applause for it. He had, notably, not arranged for an interpreter. What he did not have was any apparent awareness that Mrs. Zhao had not understood a single substantive sentence since she sat down. Marguerite poured a second round of water and went back to the sideboard and thought about her mother's most recent bill from the Lakeshore General, which was sitting on the kitchen counter at home because she had not yet decided how to manage it. She thought about the temporary withdrawal from McGill, which was approaching its 2nd anniversary. She thought about Gaston, who ran a tight ship and had made it gently clear on more than one occasion that the private dining room was not a place for complications. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about Mrs. Zhao, who was currently examining a clause on page 4 of a 12-page document that Sheridan had slid across the table with a pen placed deliberately beside it, and whose expression had shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something that was no longer politely neutral. It was the expression of someone who had found something they were not supposed to find. Marguerite had been studying Mandarin for 6 years. She had spent a semester in Chengdu. She had written her undergraduate thesis on cross-cultural negotiation frameworks in East Asian business contexts, and she was standing 4 meters away from a woman who appeared to be on the verge of signing a document she may not have fully understood, in a room where no one else had the first idea what was happening. She refilled the bread basket. She came back to the sideboard. She looked at the door. Then she looked at Mrs. Zhao again, and Mrs. Zhao looked up from page 4 and caught Marguerite's eye for just a moment. And in that moment, Marguerite made a decision that her better judgment could not quite talk her out of. She stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, first in English directed at no one in particular, and then, turning slightly toward Mrs. Zhao, "Nin hao, Nusa, 需要我的帮助吗?" The table went still. Bellecourt set down his wine glass. Sheridan looked up from his phone, and Mrs. Zhao, composed, silver-haired, 60 years old, and clearly accustomed to rooms that underestimated her, turned toward Marguerite with an expression that was, for the first time all evening, entirely unguarded. She said, in Mandarin, "You speak Chinese." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Marguerite said, also in Mandarin, keeping her voice low and professional. "I worked as a researcher in Shanghai for a summer, and I studied East Asian business at McGill. I noticed that there may not have been a translator arranged for this evening. I apologize for the interruption. I only wanted to offer, if it would be helpful." Mrs. Zhao was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What is your name?" "Marguerite." "Marguerite." Mrs. Zhao repeated it carefully, with the emphasis slightly redistributed. "Please stay." Bellecourt had been watching this exchange with the particular expression of a man who has walked into a room and discovered that the furniture has opinions. What did she say?" he asked Sheridan, who appeared equally lost. "She asked the server to stay," Marguerite said, in English, turning back to Bellecourt with the same professional composure she used when explaining the evening specials. "Mrs. Zhao would like me to translate, if that's acceptable." Bellecourt opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Sheridan, looked at Mrs. Zhao, who was watching him with the serene patience of someone who has already recalibrated her understanding of the situation and found it instructive. "Of course," Bellecourt said, and his smile came back, practiced and wide, the smile of a man who has decided that this development could still be managed. "Of course, absolutely, whatever makes our guest comfortable." What happened over the next 40 minutes was, in Marguerite's experience, unlike anything that had happened to her in 4 years of carrying plates. She stood at a slight remove from the table and translated, and as she translated she listened. And as she listened, she understood that what Bellecourt and Sheridan had brought to this table was not a partnership agreement in any meaningful sense. It was a document of extraordinary cleverness, the kind that required a certain kind of fluency to read. Not just linguistic fluency, but the particular fluency of someone who understood how clauses were structured to say one thing while accomplishing another. The opening pages were straightforward. A joint development project in Quebec's lower St. Lawrence region, reasonable revenue sharing, standard liability language. It read like a solid agreement. Page 7 was where it changed. Buried in a paragraph about operational adjustment mechanisms was a clause that gave Vantorp and Associates unilateral authority to restructure the revenue distribution schedule following any quarter in which operational costs exceeded a threshold that was defined in Appendix C in terms specific enough to be almost certain to trigger. meaning that Mrs. Zhao's company would carry the development risk and the capital outlay, and that Van 't Hoop would retain the ability to revise the returns downward once the project was past the point where withdrawal made economic sense. It was not illegal. It was worse than illegal. It was designed to be unassailable. Marguerite translated the first 6 pages faithfully and professionally, keeping her voice even, keeping her face neutral. When she reached page 7, she paused. Mrs. Zhao looked at her. The next section, Marguerite said, in Mandarin, carefully describes what is called an operational adjustment mechanism. I will translate it exactly as written, but I want to note that the definition of the threshold that triggers this mechanism is contained in Appendix C, which is the last document in the package. You may want to read them together. She said it the way she would have said, "The halibut this evening is particularly good," without inflection, without drama, with the precise neutrality of someone simply providing information that had been requested. Mrs. Zhao's eyes did not move from Marguerite's face for a long moment. Then she said, "Please translate the clause exactly." Marguerite did. Then she translated Appendix C, and then, because Mrs. Zhao asked her to, she translated them a second time, side by side. Bellecourt had been watching all of this with the comfortable expression of a man who assumed that the language barrier he had relied upon was still largely in place. He was refilling his own wineglass and had just begun a conversational aside to Sheridan about the project timeline when Mrs. Zhao set down the document. She set it down with the particular deliberateness of someone who is choosing the gesture carefully. "Mr. Bellecourt," she said in English, and both men startled slightly, because this was the first time she had addressed either of them directly. "I have been conducting international business for 31 years. Her English was accented but precise, each word placed with intention. "In 31 years, she continued, I have encountered many agreements. Some were good, some were poor. A very small number were designed by people who believed that the person across the table would not read what they had signed." Bellecourt's smile had not left his face, but it had changed entirely, the way a photograph changes when you understand the context of it. "This agreement," Mrs. Zhao said, "belongs to the 3rd category." She folded her hands on the table. "I did not come to Montreal to be managed, Mr. Bellecourt. I came because I was told you had something worth my time." The room was very quiet. The candles on the table had burned down slightly and the light had shifted to something more amber, warmer, and less forgiving. "I think," Mrs. Zhao said, "that this dinner is finished." She stood. Sheridan stood reflexively, then appeared to realize that standing was not helping him. Bellecourt remained seated for a half-second too long before getting to his feet, and in that half-second, Marguerite saw the exact moment when he understood that there was no version of this evening that he was going to be able to recover. "Mrs. Zhao," he started. "My office will be in contact with your legal team," she said, which was not an invitation to continue. She turned from the table, and then, precisely because she chose to, she turned back. She looked at Marguerite. "Nin jiao Margarita-sama," she said. "Your name is Marguerite, yes?" "Shida, Nusa." "Yes, ma'am." "Nin hai zai du shu ma?" "Are you still studying?" Marguerite hesitated for just a moment, not from confusion but from the unexpected weight of being asked a question she had been avoiding for 2 years. She said, "What's answer shu shola?" she said. "I took a leave. Temporarily." Mrs. Zhao nodded once, the nod of someone who has heard that particular word. Temporarily. Enough times to understand what it usually means. "I see," she said, slipping back into English, and something in the phrase carried the register of a woman who genuinely did. She reached into the slim case she had kept beside her chair all evening and produced a card, which she placed on the table beside the folded documents. not pressed into Marguerite's hand, placed on the table so that Marguerite could choose to take it or leave it. "My executive assistant's contact is on the back," she said. "If you finish your degree, I would like to speak with you again. What you did tonight took judgment. That is rarer than language." She picked up her case and walked to the door, and Gaston, who had materialized in the hallway the way senior maitre d's do when something significant has occurred in one of their rooms, held it open with the expression of a man who understood that certain evenings were beyond the scope of his ordinary authority. The door closed. Marguerite stood beside table 3 in the amber light of the burned-down candles, the business card on the tablecloth in front of her. Bellecourt still sitting in his chair with the posture of a man who has not yet finished realizing what has happened to him. Sheridan was gathering the documents in the efficient, purposeful way of someone who needs to do something with their hands. Marguerite picked up the card. She read it once, and then she turned it over and read the back. Then she set it carefully in the pocket of her apron, beside her order pad and the pen she carried out of habit, even in a room where she rarely needed to write anything down, because the guests in the private dining room rarely ordered anything that required writing. They simply expected things to appear. She began clearing the table. Crystal first, then plates, then the bread basket that had gone mostly untouched. She worked with the same economy she always did, the same precision, moving around the 2 men who were still sitting in the remains of an evening they had planned differently. Bellecourt watched her for a moment. "You just cost us a $40 million deal," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He said it the way people say things they intend to sound calm about. Marguerite picked up his wineglass. "I translated," she said. "That's what I was asked to do." She carried the tray to the sideboard and set it down without a sound, and she didn't look back at the table because there was nothing there worth looking at. In the hallway, she found Gaston waiting. She expected the particular expression that Gaston wore when he was working through a problem that had no comfortable solution. The faint compression around his eyes, the way his chin dropped slightly. She had seen it before in the 18 months since she'd been assigned to private dining, usually when a guest had made a demand that couldn't be met gracefully. She prepared herself for it. What she saw instead was something closer to the expression he'd worn the night. She'd correctly anticipated a table of 8 requiring a 4th bottle of wine before anyone had asked, and he'd told her afterward quietly that she had good instincts. "Mrs. Zhao's driver has been waiting," he said. "She left something for you at the front." "An envelope." Marguerite looked at him. "I don't open envelopes that don't belong to me," he said, with the faint dryness of a man who has been running a dining room long enough to have seen most things. "But I did note that Mrs. Zhao asked for your full name before she left the building." He said nothing else. He didn't need to. The envelope was waiting on the host stand, sealed, her name written on the front in a hand that was precise and unhurried. Inside was a note, 3 lines, in English. "The medical costs of a parent's illness should not determine the future of a person with your capabilities. Please contact my office at your convenience. This offer has no expiration." Beneath the note was a check. Marguerite stood at the host stand in the quiet of the front hall and held the check and read the number written on it twice, because the first time she wasn't sure she had seen it correctly. The second time confirmed it. It was enough to cover her mother's outstanding bills. It was enough, with careful management, to cover the last 2 semesters of her degree. It was written on the account of the Zhao Family Foundation, in the careful, deliberate hand of a woman who had spent 31 years in rooms where other people assumed she wasn't reading what was in front of her. Outside, Through the glass doors of Auberge d'Orval, the lights of Old Montreal were doing what they always did in November, scattering against the wet cobblestones in long orange streaks, the old city looking simultaneously like itself and like a version of itself that existed only in the specific hour before midnight, when the tourists had gone in and the streets belonged to the people who actually lived there. Marguerite folded the note. She put the check carefully in her jacket pocket, separate from her apron, which she untied as she walked toward the staff room to get her coat. She thought about her mother, who had an appointment at Lakeshore on Thursday that Marguerite had been dreading for a week. She thought about the McGill Red Mission form she had downloaded 4 months ago and saved to her desktop without opening. She thought about a woman who had sat in a room where no one thought she was listening and had understood everything. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She pushed open the staff door to the side street, where the cold came off the St. Lawrence in the particular way it did in November, clean and absolute, the kind of cold that makes everything feel slightly more possible. She walked toward the metro with the card in one pocket and the check in the other, and she did not look back at the restaurant, because there are some evenings that are better understood from the direction you are heading than from the direction you came.